So we're working on figuring out the structure of clauses in English, sort of building it up piece by piece, or figuring out maybe a different way to put it is figuring out what a plausible story is for the hypothesis that the theory that we're looking at uses to explain the structure of clauses in English and other languages. So with the idea that we looked at last time already was that the clause is basically can be incorporated into general X-bar theory by considering it to be an IP or inflection phrase. And it's built not around the verb, but around the inflectional elements in the clause. Things like tense and agreement with the subject that links the subject and the verb together. And those things are typically found on verbs in a language, so we're going to want to have an explanation for that. So there's going to be a relationship of some kind between the I node, the head of the clause, and the verb. Those are going to be in some kind of close relationship. The subject of the clause is also going to be in a relationship with the I node by virtue of its agreement property, the fact that it triggers agreement properties on the I node and or the verb. And that's going to be something that happens in language after language. Some languages will also have that agreement with the object, but the basic scenario is that languages more often have agreement, like English does, with the subject on the verb, but not the object. So there's almost an implicational hierarchy that you will have agreement on objects, and sometimes more than one even. Some languages will allow you to have indirect object and direct object agreement on verbs, but you will find that only if there is also subject agreement. Some languages won't have any actual inflectional morphology at all. So we want to so the idea is we can separate out, at least at some kind of conceptual level, the inflectional morphology part of the clause, and that's going to be in English is going to be there in general across clauses of all kinds and across languages. So that's the idea. And then we have another slot up there that allows us to put in complementizers, because we saw there are different kinds of prepositional-like things or article-like things that are there not to introduce DPs, but to introduce clauses. And so there's a higher-up structure that we're going to use actually for a bunch of things, not just for getting complementizers in there. And so that's what I want to do right now, is look at something else that we can use that higher node for. So tag questions are these things like this. My sister should drop them right now, shouldn't she? Or I should go to the store, shouldn't I? You ought to do that, shouldn't you? You didn't do that, did you? That have a certain property, a certain set of properties that are keyed to the structure of the clause and that are looking at the I node. That's going to be one of the claims, right? The way you make tag questions is key. You have to dial in what is in the I node as well as what's in the subject slot of the clause. So one way of doing this, one way of thinking about how you build a tag question is you could say, well, make a copy of the whole clause and stick in a C slot in it. Make sure that C slot is there for you. And the reason I put it on the left, I put it there in faded out font, because the one theory is that all clauses are really CPs. Main clauses in English are typically CPs in declarative mode, that main clauses in declarative mode rather than in question mode are CPs with a covert C or a null C or a silence, whatever you want to say, right? But that slot, you could say, is still there, just always sitting there. But usually you wouldn't draw it if you were just drawing a main clause, because it's just extra work. But in some cases, and tag questions would be one of them, the C node would actually be used. So let's say you make a copy in your mind. In original transformational grammar, you would have done this as a copy process. You would actually make a copy, and then you'd go about deleting things. And that's sort of what we're doing as a way of thinking about this. So let's make a copy, and then the next step is to move so one of the things that's going to be very important in this theory is that things can move around in trees, and that's one of the main transformations and one of the main kinds of movement transformations is that heads, like verbs and auxiliaries and things in the I node, will move in head-to-head fashion. They can move in head-to-head fashion up the clause. They'll move in, typically at least, in upward direction in the clause. So should can move from the I node to the C node. And what we're doing is giving ourselves an opportunity to build the tag part of the question, the tag part of the sentence in the tag questions, which we know is done according to some kind of rule. And then what we do is to add an int to it, because the rule says whatever the negation value is right. If you were to write it out as a rule, you would say, make a tag question by figuring out what the first auxiliary in the sentence is. If there isn't one, then put one in. And if you were going to put one in, put do. And then give it the opposite negation value in the tag question from whatever it is in the main question. So for the main clause. If the main clause has should, then in the tag question, you need to have shouldn't, right? In an ordinary tag question. So we just put int on the auxiliary, which has moved into C, and then we substitute a pronoun. Actually, see, most of this stuff is just kind of just routine stuff that you do in English. You're not going to repeat my sister in two adjacent clauses. That just wouldn't, you could, but it would be weird. What you're going to do is turn the later one, usually, not the earlier one, you're going to turn the one that comes after into a pronoun. So make that be a pronoun that has the same value in terms of whatever you need it to have a value for. In this case, gender and number. So it's the semantic gender of the noun phrase and the number. So it's third person, semantically referring to a female. So you put in she. And I guess sort of like something like animate human, or at least kind of human, like a pet maybe would be okay, but not probably a worm that may or may not be female, right? So it's complicated. Then what you do is another ordinary rule of English, which is, well, you're not going to repeat a full noun phrase. You're going to put a pronoun in. You're also not going to be repeating full verb phrases that are exactly the same. So by virtue of the fact that we've made a complete copy with the exact same meaning and everything, we're just not going to repeat that verb phrase. And we have already a rule that says, well, in these kinds of circumstances, elide the verb phrase, right? So it's just ordinary verb phrase ellipsis, ordinary pronominalization, and a rule. Really, that's all that's involved here, right? Copy the meaning and everything of the sentence that you're tagging, do the normal processes, except also put the auxiliary in front of the subject pronoun and give it a different value with respect to negation or affirmation, right? So we end up with my sister should drop them right now, shouldn't she, right? With lots of empty structure. Now, in the theory that we're looking at, remember that you'll see it typically displayed with traces for everything that was originally there, often, right? Usually, tag questions aren't given this big of an analysis, so you wouldn't see it. The representations aren't generally even given, but still the idea that that's the kind of process that we have going on at some level in our knowledge of how this the knowledge that we're engaging in order to produce these is the idea. Okay, so let's take a case where we have my sister should have dropped them right now, and here we've got two auxiliaries, right? How are we going to get that other auxiliary in there? We've got should in the I slot. We don't really want have to be in the I slot, right? Because it's not the thing that's carrying the inflection, the tense and agreement, those inflectional properties. It's in a certain inflectional form, a certain verb form. In this case, it's in the infinitive verb form. So it does have, and there happens to be no morphological form to show that. It's absence of any inflection, and that actually could have various meanings. So it's not like there's any real form there at all, but still we would say it's in its infinitive form. And we have, in the tag question, we would have, or in the declarative, we would have should in the I slot. And I'm assuming here that should does not start off in a V slot and then move to I, although we could do that. That there would be no harm in doing that. Just maybe all we're doing is skipping a step. That would be a possibility. But we are going to say that other auxiliaries, other than the modals and do, and well, probably all others but those, start out in a V slot. Because we know that they can come after a modal, and so there has to be a slot for them anyway. And, well, we could do it in different ways, and you will see in various versions of this theory, different things are used. You could use, one of the things you could do is say, well, okay, that's a perfective auxiliary. And so people have said, okay, it's not a V, it's a perf. And then you have a perf bar and a perf phrase, right? Or you could say, well, this gives you some aspectual notion of the clause, so let's call it an asp thing, right? And then you'd have an asp head node instead of V, right? But really, those are just abbreviations over, we know that these are V-like in some way, right? So those are subcategories of verb. So you're just taking the simplest possible story here and saying, well, that's a V. The auxiliary verbs are Vs. They're Vs by virtue, and they're Vs of a certain kind. They're Vs that take verb phrases as their complements, is the basic idea here. Okay, so then we have a structure like that, and then when we do the tag question, we can end up with, my sister should have dropped them by now, shouldn't she have? Would be fine, right? I think you have to make, I don't know, you guys tell me. You have to make the have do its, this would be normal anyway, but in this case you would make it, because the emphasis is going to be on shouldn't. A tag question is going to, another part of this, in terms of the intonational contour of the tag question, there's lots of stuff in the grammar of English, right? It's going to say, put the most stress, or do something to the intonation contour, I don't know what it is, make it go high or whatever. Shouldn't. It's going to go high on whatever is the I, in this case, which happens to have been moved to C. So since the emphasis all goes on that, shouldn't you have? The have, if it goes in there, has to be, actually it's the contracted form of have, right? I should have done that, right? It's kind of interesting, right? Usually you would only do that if you've got the auxiliary right next to it, but this one doesn't really care. It just says, I'm going to criticize, I'm going to become of, which for people will often spell it as OV, right? Because it's homophonous with that. In the spoken language, it's a clitic. Moves on to the have, actually. So we get, shouldn't she have? My sister should have done that, shouldn't she have? Right? Or we could alternatively do a different verb phrase ellipsis that takes out that whole verb phrase, and we get, shouldn't she? She should have done that, shouldn't she? Which is fine that way either, right? They seem to both be equally good as far as I can tell. So, and all of this makes sense because all we want to do is not repeat superfluous things, right? We can, right? But we want to just get away with repeating things that we can recover from the previous discourse. So maybe the preferred option here, I don't even know, but the preferred option might be, I would expect, well, elide the biggest possible verb phrase that you can. But whatever you do, you're going to do whole phrases, right? So notice that this phenomenon is really interesting because it gives us evidence for having stacked VPs. Not only does it give us evidence for having the auxiliary, the first auxiliary outside of a VP, so stacking up of verbs in this sort of fashion, right? And this is the classic argument for going to an X-bar theory with auxiliary verbs being stacked in this fashion. The original Chomskyan proposal for English was that there was an aux node where all of the auxiliaries gathered in a string. Because the idea was, well, they're all just auxiliaries. I don't know where they go. Let's put them all in one slot. And it took like, I guess, about 15 years for the theory to progress to the point where the argument could be made for having this sort of basic structure for auxiliary verbs and main verbs. So we could say that should, in its lexical entry, would be, in this case, we could say it's of category I. It's something that, by its intrinsic nature, wants to go in the I slot in the clause. And it has a verb inflection value itself. It's in the past tense form. So the verb v infl here, I'm saying, is the inflectional form of the verb inflection, because it's also going to be, I'm not showing it here, but it still is a subcategory of v. And it's going to have a verb inflection feature. And it's also going to have a comp feature or a complement. It's going to take a complement, and that complement has to be in a certain form. And the fact that we're getting the complement as a verb phrase with a head verb in a particular inflectional form itself is a consequence not of the tree structure, but of the lexical value of should. And this would be the same for other modal auxiliaries. And then have would be of category V, because it's going to want to go in the tree in a V slot. Now I'm going to come to a minute, I'm going to show you that it can start out in a V slot, but then has to be able to move into the I slot and into the C slot in cases as well. So, and that's by virtue of it being an auxiliary verb. That's part of the nature of auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs can go into the I slot, and things in the I slot are the only things that can move into the C slot, is the basic constraint, right? Okay, so, but we want to say that we're going to start our life if we're the auxiliary verb have, and we could have different inflectional features ourselves, right? This have can also have a version that's had and has and so forth, and those would just be versions of the same thing, but with different V infl features. And that's just part of our lexical knowledge. We know that things that are of category V have different V infl features. That's all rule governed. And we know that things that are intrinsically of category I can only have a certain range of those. They can only have present and past, and they don't have any others. Okay, but if I'm this have, and there's more than one have, right? If I'm this have, I'm one that has a verb phrase complement. I have a VP complement, and that complement has to be in the past participle form. It has to. So I'm saying the VP has to have the past participle feature, and the whole VP will have, anywhere it needs to, will have the feature of its head verb. That's a general principle that we're just appealing to implicitly here. So that's saying my VP complement has to have as its head a verb whose V infl features are had, those of had, right? Or dropped or eaten, depending on what the past participle form of the verb is, right? So the grammar here is complete. We have a complete account of all of the relevant aspects of the grammar, by using the tree structures, using the assumption that you have intrinsic, mutable category values in the lexicon, and other properties about where you go and what has to be around you that come from the lexicon. We can say, in some theories, the way that you would do this is when you put those words into the tree structures with their lexical features, and their meanings, all of that stuff goes right into the tree. All we're doing, in some sense, is skipping that, because you would then end up with humongous trees that would take you forever to draw a single one, and all of that. But there are head-driven phrase structure grammar is a popular, relatively popular current theory of syntax that computational people like to use a lot, because it has everything displayed always, right? Tree structures and feature values of this kind are splashed out all over the tree. But you need to have whole pages for sentences like, the boy went into the room, right? Which is kind of what we're doing anyway, but some theories do it more than others is all. So then an auxiliary verb then is something that has those features, right? That takes as a VP complement something whose features are it determines. That's what main verbs don't do that. They don't say it generally. They don't say, I need to have a VP complement and I need it to be in a certain form. It's not really true that doesn't ever happen, but because some verbs will do that, but that's not the general nature of main verbs. And main verbs are not going to ever, here's the key thing, main verbs don't have the possibility of ever moving into the I node. That's a fact about English. That's what makes us have auxiliary verbs. One of the key things that makes us have auxiliary verbs. So if we have, my sister has dropped them already, hasn't she? I don't have the V doesn't have, I don't have any auxiliaries here, right? The only auxiliaries have. And we know that we could say that, well, have can be uninflected, right? There's an uninflected version of it. Even when that happens, though, or what we can do is just abstract away from all of the potential inflectional verb form features that it could have, and say, well, yeah, that's sort of its bare bones lexical value. And that's maybe what we put into trees often. And that's what we put in here. And then we're going to say, we could do this story in different ways. But this is the standard way of doing this, because we want to say that the info node, the I node, is always occupied. And in this case, it's going to be occupied by simply a feature value. And the feature value will be, we're going to, in a main clause, there's going to be a tense value. You're going to be present or past tense. In a main clause, because we want to capture that notion somehow, right? That, if you're a main clause, then one thing you've got for sure is present or past tense. Got to be there. So tense has to be there. In some versions of the theory, the I node is some versions split it up, the inflection, into tense and agreement as separate things. And there would be a T node, and that would be the one, if you're going to do it that way, T and agra nodes, agra for agreement, then those would be separated out with the T at the top. And that would be the thing that corresponds to the whole clause. And the T could have different values. So the idea here is that it may not even be realized morphologically, but there's always going to be at the head of a main clause, a tense main clause, there's going to be a tense value. So there's a present tense feature, and then an uninflected V has to have the same V info value of the I of which it which governs it, which is up above it. And the way that that works for auxiliary verbs, not for main verbs. We have to have a different story for main verbs. We have really good evidence that this doesn't happen for main verbs. Is that the auxiliary verb moves into the I slot. So that's what makes it like the auxiliary verb should. If should is around, or could, or can, or will, then have won't do anything. It will stay put. But if there is no other auxiliary higher up in the clause, then you get verb movement. The auxiliary verb moves to the I node. Okay? Pretty simple idea, right? Although you might be thinking, why on earth would you go through all this? Why don't you just say, put the verb before the, whatever. Well, that's all we're saying at some level, right? We're just giving it the attempt here is to give sentence structure a single template that works across all phrase types, that allows for you to have rules that switches the order of things and gets the right morphology, and that will work across languages. And this system has been shown to at least have a certain amount of explanatory power in its ability to work across different languages. And I'm going to show you in a minute how you could use it in a simple case for another language. Sure, there are lots of really complex languages where it might be hard to show. But even in those cases, in lots of cases with languages with many more complexities than English has, the same basic system can be used. So we move the have to that place. It's in its present tense mode and has a third-person subject, so it's got to be has. You don't have to say it gets transformed, but the only thing that would give the right output then, another way of looking at it, would be to have stuck in the has form of have from the beginning. Another way of saying it, right? Okay, so we end up with my sister has dropped them already, and then we want to make it into a tag question, so we're going to do I to C movement, getting has going up into the C slot, having she in the tag question, and then notice the traces of that. If we were going to draw this without fonts that fade away, then we would put a T in each of those empty slots, which would show where has originated from. So where there would be a chain that has heads all the way through the clause with T's with the same note, with the same subscript notations on them to say, I'm the same thing. I'm occupying, or another way of looking at it is that this has occupies all the possible auxiliary verb slots simultaneously, all at once. Okay, and then we do the negation, hasn't she, and verb phrase ellipsis to leave us with nothing but emptiness below she. Okay, so let's look at building on what we learned from the first homework assignment. It'll be pretty easy to look at how this stuff works out in Brazilian Portuguese and why this system is really nice, because it is able to easily account for and explain what's the same about the two languages and what's different as well. So it's only, the differences are systematic and small. So if we take, is your mom watching the news? Is that what I have up there? And then that's a yes/no question, right? So I'm asking for the simplest answer, the most routine answer would be, in English, would be yes. Or we could say, yes, she is, where there would be some emphatic stress on is, right? Wouldn't there? Yes, she's. Absolutely impossible to contract the is, right? Because why? Because the rule says emphasize that, right? And this is kind of important because that's going to be something that is the same across the two languages. It's going to be whatever you do, emphasize, not whatever you do, but I guess you also put emphatic stress on yes, right? In either case, right? Yes. Or yes, she is. You would put less, right? And put some more on his, whatever. There's some kind of intonation contour there. Now, in Brazilian Portuguese, I know about this because the first job I had as a PhD student in linguistics at UC San Diego, I had the good fortune of being able to work under a master of, one of the true masters of theories, one of the proponents of a major theory of second language teaching. And he was a colleague of, you might have heard of Stephen Krashen, who's a kind of controversial figure now. But in any case, they, together with Tracy Terrell being the person I'm thinking of who has passed away, being the one who was into language pedagogy. Krashen was providing the theory and was taking actually Chomskyan theory in some version, right? And saying that, oh yeah, well you've got this, the grammar is kind of, all there, right? But in order for you to figure things out, how everything works, you need to have, what's the thing that language learners need to have? Lots of, in the Krashen Terrell theory of language acquisition, you need to have primarily lots of comprehensible input, right? So you're going to get comprehensible input, and then you're going to develop in the language learners the ability to understand first, right? They're going to be understanding you from day one. In the foreign language classroom, and I had students that had never had any Portuguese at all. That was the primary population of students, right? So you want to be then doing lots of things with visual displays and speaking slowly and repeating things over and over. This is a cup. Oh, look at the cup I have, and that kind of thing, and over again. Is this a cup? And then you're supposed to say, all you have to do is say yes, right? Doesn't take you long to figure out how to say yes, right? But in Brazilian Portuguese, you're in a kind of, if you want it to be also natural, it's got to be natural comprehensible input, right? Not just, you can't just make up crap that's easy, right? And one of the main mechanisms in this particular model was to get yes/no questions coming out of students fairly early on, right? And so I was just in a world of hurt because you're in trouble with Portuguese. And here's why. You can see the question is sort of the same. There's some differences, like you often put in articles when you have possessive phrases. You don't have to, but you often do. Who knows why? And you have kind of the same basic sentence structure, where you have if you're talking about present tense activities, you have a progressive auxiliated structure with a form of a verb be and all of that. There's more morphological stuff there. Some of it is fairly opaque in the sense that there isn't like really clearly separable morphemes. But in any case, you have, and I didn't put it all in here, right? Watching the news, the is in the singular masculine article form, and noticiario would be as well. The O on the end there is saying, oh, I'm masculine singular, so I didn't put everything in terms of the morphology there. But, well, you say, okay, well, that's simple. The answer is yes, there is a word for yes, right? But it turns out that that's completely unnatural. Not impossible, but completely unnatural. You wouldn't want to be teaching that to students. So you wouldn't do that. Instead, what you would do would be to say, and so you see the problem is that Oh, well, in this case is not quite as hard, right? What you do is simply repeat the auxiliary verb with stress on the auxiliary verb, and in this case on the second syllable. In fact, actually what you would do, if you really wanted to be natural, is that you would not even give it in the está form, which is very much like the Spanish verb. It's the same verb for those of you who know Spanish, but it would just be ta. The S syllable part is gone. In the spoken language, it's almost totally gone. But I'm putting it here because you would often put it in writing, and you could do it that way. Or you could say, él está, sí. That would be okay, right? But it wouldn't be as natural. It wouldn't be what you would normally get. So the problem then is that you have to be able to control the entire verbal paradigm, with all of its complex morphology, in order to answer a yes-no question in a natural way. So you can't, it's sort of a real dilemma that I never really solved. I went on to different ways of eliciting things. So if I ask this one, you can see where it gets to be difficult, because I say, você está assistindo a mesma coisa, where you've got, are you watching the same thing? Then the answer would have to be, notice what you'd have to do in order to answer that. I'm asking you, are you doing this? I'm going to have to give the verb form in its correct conjugated form in the right tense and with the right agreement. In the first case, all I had to do was repeat. That one isn't actually quite as hard, right? I just have to repeat. I have to figure out what the auxiliary verb was there and repeat it exactly as it was given, right? Él está asistiendo? Está. That would be fine, right? Put it in exactly the same form. But in this case, I'm asking, if I'm addressing you, you then have to say, I am, right? And in that case, you have to put the verb in its conjugated form. And so you just have to know that. And that isn't simple, because you spend the entire first year in a first year Portuguese class learning that. So the answer would just be simply, yes would be estou or to. That would be it, nothing more. And it's in the present first singular subject. All of that information is packed into the ending on the verb, right? You're getting the complexity of this. Or you could say, eu estou, sim. But that's a more complete answer than would be natural. You're wasting time there because you don't need to put in the subject pronoun. Okay, so then the grammar of this is, we've got the same thing that you've got in English for the basic clause structure. There would be an auxiliary verb. Actually here, I'm taking a shortcut. I don't know. The auxiliary verb probably, you'd want to say, they don't have modal verbs. They don't really have modal verbs in Portuguese. The equivalent of can, will, should, and all of that. They just use regular main verbs for that. And so probably actually está here, though, should be a V at the initial level. And I'm just skipping that because it's too much work to draw, or I didn't bother to go to the trouble. But it wouldn't matter, right? If it were, it would still have to end up in I. It's got to do that. So we've got the inflected verb form, and this is going to be a regularity across languages, and in Brazilian as well as English, right? The inflected V, the one that's showing tense, and there's only going to be one in any given clause. There's going to be one verb that's going to be showing tense and possibly subject agreement. And that verb is going to be in the I know, no matter what you do. Again, here I'm saying, well, let's just start it out in I, but it might be that it actually moves there. So we have the auxiliary verb in I, and we have the subject. In order to do a tag question, we put the subject in the pronominal form, so eu, I, and then we put estou. It has to be in the present first singular subject form in order to agree with the subject. So my question, it's not a tag question, I'm doing just a yes-no question. I would have the complete sentence with the proper form of the verb stuck in. I could have a pronoun in the subject slot, and I could repeat the whole thing. So it wouldn't be wrong to say, eu estou assistindo ao noticiário, as a response to the question, are you watching the news, right? That would be fine, right? But that wouldn't be an ordinary answer. What I would do, might put the scene on there at the end, the yes part, which is actually S with a nasalized E vowel, right? The M isn't pronounced. The M represents nasalization of the vowel before it. Any M after a vowel grapheme in the language only ever represents nasalization of it, for whatever reason. It's part of the writing system that was inherited from a long time ago. So yeah, you could do it just like in English. Yeah, I'm watching yes. In English, you would do it differently though. You'd say, yes, I'm watching the news, right? In Portuguese, you would do it this way. Is that right? You put the sim at the end, right? I think at least normally. I suppose you could put it at the beginning, but it wouldn't. The normal way to do it would be this. But it's just way too much information. So what we could do is use pronoun ellipsis, basically, otherwise commonly known as prodrop. So unlike English, Portuguese, like Spanish and Italian and other Romance languages other than French, allows pronouns in subject position to be, and in object position for that matter, in both places. So unlike in Spanish, it allows object pronouns to be elided, as well as like Spanish and Italian and so forth, allows the subject to be gone. So you ordinarily wouldn't even express either of those no matter what you were doing. The subject and object, it's already been established what they are, elide them, and so this is still a possible answer, but still way too, and we could represent that as often represented as having silent pronouns in this theory represented as lowercase pro, meaning silent pronoun, because it's the theory of this phenomenon in this, or the story about this phenomenon in this theory has long been that the trees are no different. You can have empty nodes all over the place. One of the very common things you find in languages, in fact, most languages of the world, is that subject pronouns are null. But we still want to say there's a subject there, for whatever reason, because we want everything to look like English, or whatever. So we have empty pronouns in those slots, and there is so here's one case of where you would say you might be using a parameter of variation across languages. So principles and parameters model, the principles would say all clauses have the same basic structure. You've got the same clause structure no matter what. And then there are parameters of variation with respect to, what that means is types of variation, ranges of variation across languages within the same structure, within the same set of basic principles, the universal grammar part. You get some choices. And so you could say subject prodrop or subject pronoun ellipsis, fine in Portuguese, Spanish, Korean, most languages of the world. But no, the parameter is set to no for English, French, a few other languages. Swedish, I don't know, there might be some other languages. You get all kinds of weird crap, but mostly you have to look pretty hard to find languages that don't have that. But then you get kind of, half and half maybe with respect to object pronoun ellipsis. So object pronoun ellipsis, fine, or prodrop, Portuguese, Thai, Quechua, Japanese, the Chinese languages. Lots of languages would allow you to do that. But no for English, Spanish, French. So Spanish, what is it? I guess it's like English and French stand out from all the other languages of the world in having to have subject and object slots filled. And so that must be the structure you would take for all languages, right? English and French, for Christ's sake. We've got real languages that you, well, I guess they didn't really, Jesus probably didn't speak, he probably had pro-drop, but Aramaic has pro-drop for sure. Okay, I guess. And then you also could just have VP ellipsis because you have that all over the place in the language anyway, too. So we can do that. We could have eostosin, or so with pro-drop, no sin, and so forth, and you just get sto, which would be the natural, the most natural. So the key thing here is that this language works just like English in privileging the I node. That's the thing that has to be. Notice it's not an accident, this theory would claim, right? If you're going to ellipse a bunch of stuff and you're going to keep the bare minimum, what you're going to keep is the I node above all else. Because why? Because that's the head of the clause. If you're going to delete that, how would you do that? The only way would be to delete the whole clause, and then you wouldn't be able to be giving a response with any content to it. Something like that would be the idea here. So it's interesting, right? Like this is the only ordinary possibility for a yes/no question. So let's take this one. You're working in the backyard. Make this a question. And then the only possibility would be VP ellipsis with pro-drop for the subject, and so we would get, você está trabalhando no quintal? Estou. Which would be a perfectly complete answer in the ordinary way. Are you working in the, what am I doing here? Is this anything different? Oh, here's where we have você trabalhou no quintal hoje? I'm asking, in English, how would we translate that? You worked in the backyard today? Or on the backyard? Whatever, how would you say it in English? Did you work on the backyard today? Yeah, it should probably be on, right? Did you work on in? It could be in. Yeah, it depends on what you're doing, right? If you're just in the backyard and doing some work on things, right? Whatever, that's fine. But notice in Portuguese, remember, it's ambiguous, right? Doesn't matter. They don't care, right? Because the no would be that locative article thing that would work over in, on, at, all of those, right? Okay, so here what we're going to do is what? We're going to have to move the verb. So Portuguese is going to be a V movement language. When there's no auxiliary verb, you still have, so this comes from universal grammar. Doesn't matter whether you have auxiliary verbs or not. The head of a clause will be the I noun. You're going to have inflection in the clause showing tense and maybe tense and subject agreement. And in Portuguese, those are all smooshed together. And as they are in English, because English has almost no verb agreement anymore. And so you're going to say, well, that's in the I node. And we're going to say then that, unlike in English, because we haven't really quite gotten there yet, but if there's only a main verb, then it moves out of the verb phrase into the I node, where it then displays the inflectional properties of the clause. And so, therefore, my answer to the question, você trabalhou no quintal hoje, would be trabalhei. Trabalhei sim. Or something like that, where you would have to repeat the inful node. Because the rule is always got to have the I node, in cases like this, be the head of the clause and be the thing that gets repeated. So the main verb moves into I and stays there. No, we don't have to say it goes to C. There's no reason to do that in Portuguese because you wouldn't ever see it in that slot in yes/no questions anyway. Okay, so we go back to English. You can't say, worked you in the backyard today? You have to say, did you work in the backyard today, right? Why is that? Well, it's because we've got the same kind of structure as we have in Portuguese. You were in the backyard today, and we have a past tense feature there. The V is not in that slot, because we're going to say a key difference between English and most other European languages, for that matter, is that English doesn't have verb movement for main verbs. It only allows movement into the I slot for auxiliary verbs. And that's the explanation for why we get what we do. We have a rule of do support. This is the traditional name for the transformation, going back to Chomsky, 1965 or before, that there's a transformation that inserts do into clauses where you need them. So do support would say, well, look, I'm in trouble now. I've got to, because here I'm asking a question. And in order to ask a question in English, I have to focus on the I node. And so I've got to have content in there. But I can't move the verb there. So what I have to do is then put did in there, and it has the inflectional features. That's because it's basically showing the tense. The tense is showing on the do, and that will be just a general thing that works all over the place in the language for lots of phenomena. If I need to have emphasis, or I need to have an auxiliary thing, I have to have the I node filled, and there isn't something else already there, then I'm going to put do in there, right? And that's just an automatic consequence of the system. And then to ask a yes/no question in English, there's going to be we can say, oh, well, there's a question feature. Because we can make up whatever crap we want. It's all silent, right? There's a feature, a semantic feature, and this is just really just sort of standard stuff. There are different modes of producing sentences. There's a declarative mode, and there's a interrogative mode. The interrogative mode is different, not by content, but by a rearrangement of the form with grammatical elements. And so we can say there's a question feature in the C node, and just like the tense feature in the I node can cause things to be attracted there, the question feature in the C node causes the did to move up there, is the story, right? So it's nothing but the same kind of stuff that we have to do for lots of things. Head movement, especially verbs that are heads, can move upward in the tree in head-to-head fashion. So from one phrase, if I've got an empty head thing above me, or maybe not even empty, it could have features, or it could even have morphological content in certain cases. So this is how languages would create polysynthetic languages that have humongous sets of morphemes strung together with inflectional properties and everything glommed on into a single whole sentences into a single word. In this theory, that's because they were all displayed out there in a structure just like English, and the pronouns incorporate into things, and the verbs move up, and you do compounding and put everything together by virtue of moving heads up together, and you can smush them all. Right? There's a very general, it's a trivial instance of a very general phenomenon in languages whereby heads incorporate into higher heads. Heads that are there because of the semantics of some unit are incorporate into the unit that requires them to be there. And so here we're using that with the notion of the question semantics here. And did you work in the backyard today gives us the structure that it would allow for an answer just like Portuguese, right? Yes, I did, right? Or, of course, you could just say yes as well. Okay, so you get different types of languages that you can characterize in terms of how things can move. And one of the main things that happens in languages in this theory is verb movement. So you could say there's a pro or a pro-drop parameter or a pronoun ellipsis parameter. There's a V movement parameter. Auxiliary can move to I. Yes, in English, Brazilian Portuguese would be the same. The auxiliary verb can be in the I note. A main verb can move to I in Portuguese and French and most of the European languages and probably most of the languages of the world, except English, not going to work. So English doesn't allow that. That's probably something that happens to varying degrees in various languages. But so there would be parameters that vary across languages, whether a verb can move into the I note, whether a main verb can move to the I note, whether the I note can move to C, can or must move to C depending on circumstances. So that languages could have different combinations of these things in order to get the job done. Okay, now another thing. So we've kind of gone carefully through the steps, not giving all of the evidence. You could look at Brazilian Portuguese and French and English and take several European languages because you could see this sort of clearly, that the same kinds of phenomena happen, and there are pretty good pieces of evidence for having the verb move or not in different languages. And we're not going to go through all of that. But another thing that we do want to go through is the idea that DPs, phrases, also can undergo movement. And one of the main kinds of movements of phrases is for DPs to move in various ways. And sometimes they move from object to subject node. Sometimes they move from subject of an embedded clause to a higher clause node. So these things can move. They're going to be moving upwards in the tree in general, and they're going to be moving in stepwise fashion. You're not going to be moving in the tree generally. They're going to be moving up to the next highest node when they can or when they must. And a really important one kind of movement like this is the one that moves the DP into the subject position of the clause. So the theory is going to be that subjects of clauses actually start out not in the topmost subject slot where they almost always have to end up, but they start out inside the verb phrase. And there are going to be different reasons for that. And so I'm going to just give you one piece of evidence right now for why you might want to do that. The basic motivation, or one kind of basic semantic motivation that has some support from English and other languages, is that the arguments of a head are contained within the phrase that head projects. That's going to be the case for lots of things, and the fact that in most cases subjects have to end up higher up in the subject node slot in the clause in English is going to make that not seem plausible at first. Does that make sense? It's going to say that was not someplace anybody went until in the theory of generative grammar. People didn't really get there until the late 1980s. So that took like 30 years, 25 years to develop. And I think the first argument for this comes from professor at UC San Diego, Yuki Kuroda, who has passed away, who worked on, he was the one that actually worked out the first generative grammar of Japanese. Speaker of Japanese, goes to MIT in the 1960s, in the heyday of when generative grammar was being invented, works with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky was his dissertation advisor, writes for his dissertation, he actually wrote unbelievably the most beautiful analysis of some of the most beautiful data on California Yawalmani. I think they might have other names for it. It has one of the best phonology problems in the world, and this guy was a genius to work that stuff out. But so he actually, that's what he worked on actually for his dissertation. But at the same time, he worked out a grammar of Japanese within generative grammar. And at some point, he came along and said, you know what? Subjects in Japanese have to be inside the verb phrase. And if we look closely at English and French and some other languages, you know what? The same story works for them. And so that's and that became standard, in fact, a defining feature of this theory of grammar. That if anything else goes, that one doesn't, even though it's not the most obvious thing. So here's one kind of argument for that. Both of them should have finished the homework by now. Perfectly good sentence, right? But what we find with this, and it was one of the things that was really exciting to the people working on transformational grammar, going all the way back into the 60s, was that the general theory is if you are a sentence and you have exactly the same meaning as another sentence, but the things are arranged differently, then you must have had movement transformation that happened to you, right? And so they discovered this thing that they called quantifier float. And it turns out that quantifier float, you can imagine what that is. Quantifiers are words like most and all and much and things like that. And it turns out that this happens in similar ways across lots of languages, not just the European languages, not just the ones that are in the Indo-European language family, but you can find this in Japanese and Korean and lots of other languages. And in fact, quantifier float, the way that it works differently across English and French, for example, ends up giving evidence for French having main verbs move to I and English not. There's a complicated argument that you can build based on that. But for present purposes, I just want to look at what the facts are. So you could say they both should have finished their homework by now, right? And that means nothing different than both of them, does it? And both is in a weird slot, right? Because it's after the pronoun, and pronouns don't usually have things after them that modify them. And then you could have, they should both have finished their homework by now. Some of these are maybe more natural than others. I think this is probably the least natural of the ones that I would say are grammatical. But you could also say they should have both finished the homework by now. It's fine, right? They should have finished both the homework by now. Is that good? No. You can see there's a big difference. Whichever one you might prefer, you would say, well, yeah, those are all okay, but this one is not good at all, right? And they should have finished the homework both by now. It's also no good, right? So there's a systematicity about this. That's the key thing, right? And there are limits on when you can do. You can't do this off of anything. So that's what's interesting about it, right? What is that telling us about the structure of English clauses, if anything, right? And you could look at it in different ways. Or originally, they were interested in, the idea was the quantifier can float out of a noun phrase. It can float out. That's why it's called quantifier float. And it can float out only off of certain kinds. The main thing about these in the early days was it could float off of subjects, but not off of objects, for example, right? And in different languages, that would be different. So Italian allows you to do this with subjects and direct objects, but not anything else. So if you want to know what's a subject or a direct object in Italian, look at quantifier float. That gives you evidence for those things. When Yuki Kuroda came along and looked at this, he said, well, we've got a different analysis of this, and it shows us something else that's interesting. So it turns out that you can also say, if we wanted to focus on this phrase, right, you couldn't say it was they both that should have finished the homework, right? Although you could say they both should have finished the homework, you can't say it was they both that should have finished, can you? No, you can't ever do that. So, but you can say, what you'd have to say it was both of them that should have finished the homework, right? And so then the idea is going to be that both of them is the underlying form in some sense, but and it could end up in the subject slot, but it originated, here's the key thing, it originated as the subject of the verb inside the verb phrase. And this is going to be guaranteed by a general theory of how you put things into trees based on meanings. So finished is a verb that has two arguments. It has a finisher and thing finished. Those would be arguments of the verb. And since they're arguments of the verb, they need to be put into legitimate slots. And the agent of a verb will go into the subject slot, but into the subject slot of the verb. So here we're using this VP, specifier of VP node. It's not there randomly. We usually see it empty only because there's a constraint to the effect that the DP, that is the subject of the VP, has to ordinarily end up higher up because of some constraint guaranteeing that there be something in the subject node in the clause. Okay, you got the idea? It's not really, we're just sort of extending the basic set of metaphors that we're using to account for the structure of clauses. It's okay to have things occupy more than one slot. Both of them is both kind of because of the semantics, it's inside the verb phrase, but because of the grammar of English, it's in the highest slot in the IP or clause. So it gets there by moving, but underlyingly what we have in some sense is really both they. And there's a constraint to the effect that both they can't ever show up. It has to be instantiated as both of them, right? Or, that's one possibility. If you're going to have it be inside of a DP as a whole unit, it could be both of them. But another thing that you could do is separate out the they part and the both part. So if we're going to have they be the object of both, then there's a rule that turns it into of them. It's the only thing that you're allowed. But you could start out with both they, and the they could move out of that phrase, right? You got the idea here, right? They moves out and goes up to the subject slot in order to satisfy the need, because we're basically giving ourselves with this kind of structure where both is something that takes a DP as its object, right? Both is a quantifier of the kind, because you can have both the people did that, right? Both has the people is clearly a DP. If you can have that, then you must be able to have determiners, and we're putting quantifiers in the determiner class, that can have DPs as their complements, right? So we're just putting together things that have to be there anyway, right? You have to allow for the possibility of this kind of structure, a quantifier that has a complement, and the complement can be a DP. And there's another kind of constraint that it's a quantifier that doesn't want a nominative pronoun. If you want to put a pronoun in there, then it can't be nominative. It has to turn into of plus non-nominative form, right? But, underlyingly, you could have a they there, right? But just if you do, it can't stay there. So what do? And we need to have a DP in subject position, take the embedded DP, and leave the both behind, right? And then we get, they should have both finished the homework by now, right? And all we've done is nothing but what the grammar requires. We need to have a DP in the subject position. We can't have a they as the complement of both. we fix both things all at once, just like that, by taking the complement of the quantifier and moving it as a whole phrase up into the subject slot. And we get the same interpretation as if we had moved the whole thing. Both of them should have finished the homework by now, because we can reconstruct that both goes with they by virtue of the trace that it leaves behind, by virtue of the fact that the meaning is all actually expressed about who was the finisher, and what was finished is expressed totally within the verb phrase, right? So quantifier float is not really quantifier float so far, but rather DP movement into the subject slot. And the quantifier, some quantifiers. Now why it is just the ones that do, right? There aren't that many. Both, how many? Each can do it. Each student, each of them. They should have each finished their homework by now. That one works, right? But not all of them, right? Only a few. Then, to make matters more complicated, of course, the quantifier can actually float as well, because we know it can end up here. They should both have finished their homework by now. And it could end up, they should have both finished their homework by now. And so, but this is also going to be governed by a very general rule that's going to say, well, you know what? You can always put in adjuncts, and the both can function like an adverb adjunct and go in any adjunct slot, as long as, so it's going to be governed by general principles. Move upward in the tree, not downward, all else being equivalent. And if you are functioning as an adjunct, then go in an adjunct slot. And so we're going to allow ourselves the possibility of accounting for all of the different places it can occur, and why the ultimate bottom spot in which it can occur is where it is. That's because that's where it starts. That's where it belongs semantically, and that's where it's most natural, actually, right? Is in the one next to finished. And it can't go here because because you just don't move. There's not even an adjunct position slot there. You couldn't even put an adjunct in that position even if you wanted to. And so forth. So we have a kind of complete story of this actually fairly complex phenomenon, where you get the same meaning, you can have them both in different places, you can have a variety of different things, but it's not just anything goes. It follows certain principles. And one key to the story is this idea that the subjects of clauses actually are the subjects of verb phrases. And then we'll come back to this next time, because I'm going to stop here. But there's going to be a constraint in English to the effect that a tense clause with an inode is going to attract a subject. It's going to want to have a subject there no matter what. And in English, it's going to be an overt subject. And that's going to explain a lot of things about the grammar of English. The fact that you have to have dummy it's all over the place, right? Like, it was raining yesterday. The hell do you need it was there for, right? If you give me any decent language like Spanish or Portuguese, you don't have no it there, right? You just say, it was raining, right? But in English, you've got to have an it there because of a constraint that says, whatever else you're going to do, give me something in the subject slot, right? And that's nothing. That's just that. We need that anyway. And that's going to account for the subjects of verb phrases normally moving up into that slot at the front of the clause, okay? So it's cool, right? All we're doing is taking lots of little things that we need to have anyway. And you add them all up, you allow for a few differences between languages, and you get both English and Portuguese and Swahili with the same set of mechanisms.